When you hear trade war, what comes to mind? Probably stuff like soybeans and steel, right? Well, the US-China conflict that really kicked off back in 2018, it's about so much more than that. This isn't just a story about tariffs. We're talking about a huge shift in who's calling the shots on the world stage.
So, where did this all start? Well, it really kicks off with this number, $375.6 billion. That's how big the U.S. trade deficit in goods with China was in 2017, just before the first tariffs were slapped on. I mean, that's a record-breaking figure. For a lot of people in Washington, this was a massive red flag, a sign that something was seriously wrong with the relationship.
But you gotta ask, is this story really just about the money? Is it just about who's selling more widgets and who's buying them? Not even close. This whole thing might have started with trade, yeah, but it has completely morphed into a battle over who is going to control the future of technology. And honestly, whoever controls that controls the world. Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the backstory, the imbalance that was building for decades. Then we'll get into the tariffs themselves. After that, we'll see the global fallout. And finally, we'll get to the big twist, the new tech Cold War. All right, let's dive into part one. To really get what's happening today, you have to rewind the clock a bit and see how this whole situation got started. This timeline, it really lays it all out. So back in 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, and boom, trade just goes through the roof. But this created something economists call the China shock. And just think about that for a second. Over the next 10 years, as that trade gap widened, the US lost an estimated 2.7 million jobs. A lot of those were in manufacturing towns, and it caused some real economic pain. That, right there, set the stage for everything that followed.
So you've got all this frustration just bubbling under the surface for years, right? And then the Trump administration comes in and decides to crank the heat way up. Their weapon of choice? Tariffs. And that's the exact moment this whole thing went from a low simmer to a full rolling boil.
And this quote, it really captures the entire mindset behind the strategy. See, the idea wasn't that they were starting a war. No, the perspective was that they were finally fighting back in a war the US had already been losing for decades. It all comes down to that core feeling of being ripped off. And look, it was never just about the trade deficit. The US had a whole laundry list of complaints. We're talking about things like American companies feeling like they had to hand over their secret sauce, their technology, just to get a foot in the door in China. And then there's the massive intellectual property theft. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year. It all added up to this feeling that the Chinese government was just rigging the game. Okay, and this is where you see the two big arguments clash. On one side, you had the politicians saying, hey, these tariffs are going to bring back jobs, they're going to fix the deficit. But on the other side, you had most economists basically saying, hold on a minute. Their take, tariffs usually just mean higher prices for everyday people. And that trade deficit, they'd tell you it's driven by huge macroeconomic forces. You know, things like national savings rates versus investment, not by this or that trade policy. So, about those warnings from the economists, turns out they weren't just talk. The tariffs had real, immediate effects, and the shockwaves were felt all over the world. I mean, just look at these numbers. The hit to American farmers was absolutely brutal. China hit back with its own tariffs, and bam, U.S. agricultural exports to China were cut by more than half in just 1 year. That's billions of dollars in business that just vanished. A huge, painful blow right to the American heartland. So the big question is, who actually paid the price for these tariffs? Well, study after study came to the same conclusion. It was American businesses and, by extension, you, the consumer. The cost of all kinds of imported stuff went up, and that extra cost got passed right on down the line, all the way to you at the checkout. But here's a fascinating side effect. While the US and China were duking it out, other countries saw an opening. It's something called trade diversion, which is really just a fancy way of saying that business found a new route. Suddenly, countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and others started picking up the slack, making the stuff the US wasn't buying from China anymore. They kind of became the unexpected winners in this whole thing. And this is where the story takes its biggest, most important turn. Because what started out as a fight over things you can, drop on your foot, soybeans, steel, it's now a full-blown war for technological supremacy. This is the new front line. The name for it? The Tech Cold War. And that's exactly what it is. It's this incredibly high-stakes competition for control over the technologies that are going to define the 21st century. The game isn't about who can make stuff the cheapest anymore. It's about who's going to invent the future and who gets to write the rules for it. And you can see the escalation so clearly. Step 1 was tariffs on physical goods, right? Stuff you can hold in your hand. Step 2, it gets more targeted. The US starts sanctioning specific companies like Huawei, basically cutting them off from American technology. And now step 3, the fight is over the absolute bedrock of the modern economy, the tiny, mind-bogglingly complex semiconductor chips that power literally everything.
So the battlefield looks totally different now. The new strategic territory is things like artificial intelligence. It's about who designs and makes the most powerful semiconductors, who builds out the fastest 5G networks. It's even about who controls the social media platforms we scroll through every single day, like TikTok. Being on top in these fields isn't just good for business anymore. It's viewed as absolutely essential for national security.
Which brings us to this one massive, lingering question. Where is all this heading? Are we actually moving toward two separate, competing internets? A splinternet, if you will, with one digital world led by the US and its allies, and another one led by China? It sounds like science fiction, but the answer to that question could completely reshape how all of us live, work, and connect with each other for generations.